Let's break down the top waiver wire ads moving into week 14 of the 2024 fantasy football season. And with 6 teams on bye week, and this being one of the most crucial weeks of fantasy football, as we have the fantasy playoffs starting next week, you are not going to want to skip these must-add waiver wire additions for week 14. Let's kick the video off with Nick Westbrook-Ikhine of the Tennessee Titans. Listen, I'm tired of talking about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. We have been talking about him for weeks here on the channel, dating back to weeks 8 and 9. He has a touchdown in every game since week 6 of the season, except for week 10 against the Chargers. Double digits in every game since week 8 of the season, except for that same game against the Chargers. And he is coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season this past week against the Washington Commanders. 21.1 fantasy points. He had 8 targets, 3 catches, 61 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. And I don't care if the volume's low at this point. I just don't care. He's scoring the touchdowns. He's getting the fantasy production. And he has one of the, if not the best strength of schedules to finish out the entire fantasy season. And we have talked about this stretch for the past couple of weeks here on the channel as well. Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Jacksonville. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine sits at 27% roster because nobody wants to listen to me. But anyways, he is so lowly rostered that he will be the top waiver wire addition across all leagues, all formats going in to week 14. I guarantee it. This is a player who's going to help you guys get into the fantasy playoffs and be a viable flex option through the fantasy playoffs as well. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, my top must-add player on waivers moving in to week 14. All right, next up is Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers, sitting at 50% rostered. Another player, if you guys were watching the videos this past week, we talked about Adam Thielen on our last-minute waiver wire editions on Saturday's video. Love that matchup in week 13 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He finished with 10 targets, 8 catches, 99 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown, and maybe had 2 touchdowns. Was very close to that second touchdown early in the game, right? 23.9 fantasy points. Now, here's the thing with Adam Thielen. It was a smash matchup against the Bucs. Much more difficult matchup this week against the Philadelphia Eagles. But when we talked about Adam Thielen last week, I also brought up the fact that in week 17, he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers once again. As a matter of fact, I told you guys to go out and kind of quote-unquote stash Thielen heading into week 12 when he was expected to return, just because he's playing the Buccaneers twice to wrap up the season. But in between, we got Philly, Dallas, Arizona. I mean, these aren't as good of matchups, but there's definitely potential, at least against the Cowboys and against the Cardinals as well. So might be a kind of a tough idea to start Adam Thielen against the Eagles this week, as they have been shutting down wide receiver ones. And when we look at the split here, Xavier Leggett, not so bad, and that's kind of what I expected out of him. 9.3 fantasy points, 8 targets, 4 catches. And I told you guys to be very careful with going out and chasing those 20 fantasy points David Moore had in week 12. He finished with 9 fantasy points, 9 targets, 5 grabs, 40 receiving yards. So while it's close here, Thielen was still operating as the wide receiver 1 for the Panthers going in this past week. And we also got to mention that the Panthers are just playing better offensive football overall, and they have been for the past couple of weeks, something else we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks when it comes to the Panthers. And even though Chuba Hubbard had a bad game, the passing attack overall has looked much better. Adam Thielen's going to continue to be the wide receiver 1 here. Is it going to work out in week 14 on the road against Philly? Not quite sure, but for that final stretch in the fantasy playoffs and that Tampa Bay Buccaneers matchup in the fantasy championship, Adam Thielen absolutely needs to be rostered in higher than 50% of fantasy leagues. Next up is Marquez Valdes-Scantling, sitting at 42% rostered. Finished week 13 with 11.6 fantasy points. Low volume performance once again. 3 targets, 2 catches, 36 receiving yards, and a touchdown. This is another player that we've been talking about. Sneaky starts video, right? Last minute waiver videos. And then we also talked about MVS in the 8 Things You Need to Know video Sunday morning as well, as just an emergency last minute play if you need somebody to throw in at the flex position, right? And this was a good enough performance in a good matchup against the Rams. Yes, the volume was low. He only had 11.6 fantasy points, but double digits is fine, right? And he now has a touchdown in each of his last 3 games and 4 touchdowns through the last 3 games. And we did see, a little bit of volume start to get spread around, and some other wide receivers at least do something, where in previous weeks we had seen wide receivers do nothing. And don't get me wrong, there's still not a lot of volume going around here, but MVS at the end of the day is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this team, and he's getting these big play opportunities from Derek Carr, and I don't quite think that's going to slow down in Week 14 against the Giants. Pretty favorable schedule to finish out the year for the most part. Washington, Green Bay, Las Vegas. Green Bay a little bit tough. Las Vegas not as good as you would think, but we'll see what happens in a little Derek Carr revenge game there. So MVS is going to have some opportunity, but we're here in the biocalypse once again in Week 14, the second biocalypse of the fantasy season, and you might need an option like MVS. He sits at 42% rostered. I think he could definitely be a viable option for you guys in Week 14. Next up, let's take a look at Parker Washington of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, this one is kind of your dart throw for the week, but we got to throw somebody in here who almost all you guys can go out and pick up if you want to. He sits at 4% rostered. He had 24.3 fantasy points against a bad Texans secondary at home in Week 13. 12 targets, 6 catches, 103 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. I always say, be very careful about chasing points, right? We just talked about David Moore a little bit ago. This might be one of those situations, and it's not particularly a great matchup this week, and the rest of schedule here is pretty difficult. Tennessee, the Jets, the Raiders, Tennessee again. So this one's a big gamble, but if you're in a deeper format, there's nothing out there. You need to take a gamble. It did look as if Mac Jones, who I'm assuming is going to be the starting quarterback for the Jags next week, showed some good chemistry and faith in Parker Washington. So he might end up being an option. For what it's worth, he had 2 more targets than Brian Thomas Jr., 3 more targets than Evan Ingram. So maybe that bleeds over into this matchup against Tennessee. Maybe it does not. We'll find out. But if you want a desperation play, Parker Washington looked pretty good in Week 13, had the trust of his starting quarterback, Mac Jones, and that may bleed over into Week 14. We'll find out. Then last but not least, I am obviously recording this before Monday Night Football, but I want to talk about Devon Vele, a player to take a close look at and keep your eyes on after Monday Night Football. He is on bye week in Week 14. We will be talking about a couple players on bye week in today's video, but not too many in terms of Week 14. I just want to keep a close eye on Devon Vele because he sits at 40% rostered. The past 3 weeks, he's had double digits in 3 straight games. A player that we talked a lot about going into this Week 13 matchup against the Cleveland Browns, a favorable matchup for wide receivers. And if he has another good game, you're going to be kind of in one of these spots. Can I afford to roster him this week because of the biocalypse? Or am I going to try and fight for him going into Week 15? But just keep in mind, it's a pretty favorable strength of schedule for the fantasy playoffs for the Broncos wide receivers. Colts, Chargers, Bengals, at least 2 of those matchups favorable in terms of the Colts and the Bengals. So Vele, definitely a player just to keep monitoring as the week progresses. He may or may not be out there on waivers, may get dropped in some leagues because of the bye week in Week 14. Keep an eye on him because if he has another solid performance in Week 13, he's going to be a top waiver priority going into Week 14 and into Week 15 as well. The top waiver addition at running back this week is obviously going to be Jordan Mason, as Christian McCaffrey did suffer a ruptured Achilles, is at least the belief, during Sunday Night Football. I am literally recording this during Sunday Night Football, so I had to go back and add this part, but Jordan Mason sitting at 38% rostered. You will see him at the later portion of this video when we talk about handcuff running backs, but he's no longer going to be a handcuff running back. This might be a tough rest of the game for the Niners offense. We'll see. It is a good matchup in theory against the Bills, but been a rough start here. But CMC, I'm just going to go ahead and say, is probably going to be out for the season. So that means that the Niners and Jordan Mason over the next couple of weeks are going to get the Bears, the Rams, the Dolphins. Not so great of a matchup in Week 17 against the Lions, but not too bad the next couple of weeks for Jordan Mason, who undoubtedly will be the top waiver wire addition, maybe at any position going into Week 14, but also keep an eye on Isaac Garando as well, as we'll probably see some sort of volume, maybe go to Garando, but I'm going to bank on Jordan Mason here. Just don't forget to start the season. This guy was a player that was helping you dominate your league and help you win matchups on a weekly basis with double digits in every game through the first 4 games of the season, then fell off a little bit. But ultimately, Jordan Mason is going to be the RB1 for the Niners. And while their season is starting to slip away here, we still know this is a great offensive system led by Kyle Shanahan, and Jordan Mason is going to have a ton of fantasy value. So if he's out there and available, sitting at 38% rostered, this is your top addition in terms of running backs on the waiver wire moving into week 14. Us, the bus, Edwards, 4.3 fantasy points against the Falcons. Bad matchup here. Wasn't good, right? Not a great matchup in week 14 against Kansas City. We know J.K. Dobbins is going to be out the next couple weeks as he is on IR. And I told you guys, I'm not very high on Kamani Vidal, like going out and picking him up and potentially playing him. And we kind of saw a split here. Vidal had 4 touches. Hassan Haskins had just 1 touch, which was a lost fumble. At the end of the day, Gus Edwards got the most volume. 6 touches, 32 rushing yards, and 1 reception off of 1 target here. So Kansas City has not been as strong defensively as of late. If you're absolutely desperate, I'm only putting him on here because he is kind of highly rostered as well at 67% rostered, but I'm only putting him on here because he should see the most volume. And if you are absolutely desperate, there's nothing else out there. Gus Edwards may be worth a shot going into week 14, but I would not get your hopes up here. This is a true desperation play. But the matchup is a little bit better in week 15 against Tampa Bay. And then the following week, he gets Denver, not as good. And then we should expect to see J.K. Dobbins back in week 17. But if Dobbins isn't out there, it's a pretty favorable matchup against the New England Patriots. So desperation play. Don't go out of your way to pick up Gus Edwards. But he could be worth it because he is operating as the RB1 for the Chargers going into week 14. All right, and then very quickly, let's just take a look at the Raiders running back situation here. And once again, this is going to be a desperation-only play. Want to kind of throw some of this in here because I know we got 6 teams on bye week this week. It's going to be a tough week for a lot of fantasy managers, and we're in a lot of must-win positions, right? So first of all, we got to kind of determine Alexander Madison / Zamir White, are they going to be out this week? They were both out last week and the week before. They both got injured, right? So if Madison and or White is active this week, then this kind of hurts the idea of going out and picking up either Sincere McCormick or Amir Abdullah, who had almost close to an even split this past week. McCormick, 12 touches, 2 targets, 2 catches. Abdullah, 10 touches, 2 targets, 2 catches as well. Abdullah had 7.3 fantasy points. McCormick had 8.5 fantasy points. So it's a good matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I know the Bucs were good against a run this past week and stifled Chuba Hubbard, but I don't know if that's going to carry over into week 14. We'll find out. They haven't been very good on the run throughout this season. So once again, if Madison's out and Zamir White's out, maybe if just one of them is out, we'll have to kind of see what happens here. Then he could be in line for a spot play with either of these Raiders running backs. McCormick's 0% rostered. Abdullah is 27% rostered. So you might have a play here. And also, if we see Madison or White active, we might see McCormick head back to the practice squad. So in my opinion, this is a situation that just monitor as the week progresses and really only be eyeing the situation if you are 100% out of a starting running back here in week 14. Very quickly, as always, here are your handcuff running backs that you guys can take a look at if you're trying to handcuff your RB1 or if you're just trying to pick up that running back who might end up winning your league because a major running back one goes down going into one of the following weeks. But outside of that, you're not looking at a ton of standalone value. But I will say if Jaylen Warren is out there and available, as we've been saying for the past couple weeks, like Jaylen Warren has great standalone value, 10.4 fantasy points against the Bengals in week 13. Just 3 touches for 9 yards, not great, but he did add 4 catches off of 4 targets for 55 receiving yards. So if he's out there and available, he's definitely worth adding. And of course, a very strong handcuff, but this continues to be Najee Harris's backfield, and it has been for the past couple weeks, but just once again, very good standalone value for Jaylen Ward, and you could really argue who's the best handcuff here, who's not, and all that stuff. And there's other handcuffs out there as well. But I do want to mention that Braylon Allen is looking increasingly more attractive from a fantasy standpoint in terms of handcuffs, because we've got Breece Hall, like, maybe suffered an injury in week 11. We don't really know. The reporting's been kind of muggy. And then, he had the knee soreness, and then he wasn't very effective in week 13. I mean, he was fine, I guess, 5 yards per carry, but ultimately, the Jets in this weird place. I could just see Breece Hall popping up on the injury report again this week, and everybody panics and tries to pick up Braylon Allen as well. Then you got other guys like Ray Davis, who I just think is a really strong handcuff. Justice Hill can always get you some standalone value, and we saw Zach Charbonnet score this past week. And I also want to mention we saw more volume kind of randomly go to Blake Corum next to Kyron Williams for the Rams. So there's value here. They're all risky. They may pay off, they may not pay off, but here are your handcuff running backs going into week 14. And let's take a timeout to let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 14 NFL pick'ems are already going live, and all of their week 13 pick'ems for Monday Night Football are live as well. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code catch a free NFL pick'em to use either towards Monday Night Football or Week 14's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So it's a free NFL pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. Let's move along to the quarterback position, and let's start with Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears, currently sitting at 54% rostered. He has 26 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games, 2 or more passing touchdowns in his last 2 games, 256 or more passing yards in his last 2 games, and at least 33 yards on the ground as well. Obviously, since the Bears have made that change at offensive coordinator, Caleb Williams has just been much more effective. The overall receivers, the passing game has just been much more effective, right? Run game's taken a little bit of a hit because they are throwing more, but we're starting to see those flashes out of Caleb Williams. I know the Thanksgiving Day game against the Lions started off really slow for Caleb Williams, but you got to give him credit for what he did in the second half, right? And it's not a great matchup on the road here against the Niners, but it hasn't particularly been the best matchups over the last couple of weeks, and he's had 16 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games. So this is a week where you truly may need to stream a quarterback. If Caleb Williams is out there and available, he's going to give you a very solid shot in terms of a streaming quarterback in week 14. And one of our top streaming options at quarterback in week 13 was Russell Wilson. And boy, oh boy, did he bounce back in a great matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals in large fashion. 27.8 fantasy points, 29 to 38, 414 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a pick, and he added 3 yards on the ground. He's dropped to 41% rostered. He's had 2 tough weeks in a row, but he gets another good matchup at home against the Cleveland Browns this week. I know he played bad on the road against the Browns in week 12, but it was a snow game. What do you really expect? I think he will be fine this week against the Cleveland Browns at home. I think he's going to provide a solid floor. The upside is not going to be as high as it was against Cincinnati this past week, but ultimately, Russell Wilson in line to be another solid streaming option in week 14. Don't blink twice. We're talking about Aiden O'Connell as a potential streaming option at quarterback. I actually can't really believe this one myself, but he looked pretty solid against the Kansas City Chiefs. 23 of 35, 340 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Not too shabby. 19.6 fantasy points. And he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week. And I also want to mention one of the best overall schedules to wrap up the season. So if you're in a double quarterback super flex league, you should probably pick up Aiden O'Connell. He's going to be solid the rest of the season. Solid at best, right? 6% rostered. If you're in need of a streaming option this week, Aiden O'Connell might truly be your guy because he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, one of the best possible matchups for streaming quarterbacks. And we talked about Bryce Young going into week 13 as a potential strong streaming option. If you guys go back and watch the Sneaky Starts and Stream video, right? Going up against Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 23.6 fantasy points, 298 passing yards, a passing touchdown, and a rushing touchdown. So this is a prime spot for Aiden O'Connell to kind of start this potential run that he's going to have at the end of the season here. I'm not expecting anything crazy out of O'Connell, but 17, 18, 19, 20 fantasy points, a safe floor, I think could certainly happen as the season starts to wrap up. I mean, this strength of schedule, Tampa Bay, Atlanta, Jacksonville, and New Orleans is just super favorable for the quarterback position from a fantasy perspective. So O'Connell could be a play if you need a streaming option in week 14. He could be a play for the rest of the season if you're absolutely desperate at quarterback. And if you're even more desperate, here's another quarterback we talked about going into week 13 as a streaming option that would give you a floor, and that's Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans, sitting at 18% rostered. He was 18 of 37, 212 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. I mean, he's still having some turnover issues, had a fumble in this game. It wasn't lost. No interception, but we look since week 10, since he came back as a starter, he has 2 passing touchdowns in 3 of the last 4 games and over 200 passing yards in 3 of the last 4 games as well. By Will Levis standards, those are good things, right? And next to Aiden O'Connell, Will Levis has the next best strength of schedule to wrap up the season. Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville. We talked about this stretch earlier when we looked at Nick Westbrook-Ikini. Will Levis, a viable option at quarterback. I'm not expecting a ceiling here. This is a floor play, 16, 17, 18 fantasy points. That's what you're looking at if you do have to go out and stream or start Will Levis to wrap up the season. But I think, especially in like double quarterback superflex formats, Will Levis is an option. Once again, the ceiling's not high, but the floor is there if you get desperate at quarterback, and Will Levis, a very favorable strength of schedule to wrap up the fantasy season. Right, let's hop into the tight end position quickly here. And the first 2 tight ends we're going to go over are on bye week this week, but let's start with Zach Ertz, who has moved up to 65% rostered, but he might get dropped depending on what happens here in the biocalypse in your respective league, as he's on bye week this week. And it's not a great strength of schedule to wrap up the season as he gets the Saints, the Eagles, and the Falcons. But I've been saying for like a few weeks now that Zach Ertz is just a start category. Like, he can be started every week. He's been a top 12 tight end in fantasy for weeks now. He now has 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games and 12.5 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games. So keep a close eye on Zach Ertz. If he gets dropped, he's worth kind of picking up if you can afford to, and kind of stashing a save for the fantasy playoffs, because it hasn't even been the best couple of matchups the last couple of weeks. Philly, Dallas, Tennessee, right? And he's come through in those games. He's obviously the second pass catcher on this team behind Terry McLaurin. Has a big role in this offense, has, a lot of trust from Jaden Daniels, and he's been super solid on the season. We look at Ertz on the season as a whole. He has single digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Not so bad, being that this is a tight end, right? And like I said, the last 3 games have been very, very good overall. Zach Ertz, worth adding if he can afford to do so going into week 14. And another tight end that I've talked about a lot lately as just a player that is like a top of the streaming category and very close to a startable tight end on a week-to-week basis is Hunter Henry, who sits at 54% rostered. There's another player, 9.4 or more fantasy points in every game since week 6, except for a tough matchup, against the Chicago Bears in week 10. He's on bye week this week. Not the greatest strength of schedule to wrap up the season with Arizona, Buffalo, and the LA Chargers, but if you get absolutely desperate, I mean, this is essentially your leading receiver on a weekly basis. Almost always is the most targeted player when it comes to the Patriots on a weekly basis, and definitely the most consistent receiver on this team. Drake May has a ton of chemistry with Hunter Henry. He's that true security blanket for Drake May as a rookie quarterback, and he just continues to produce almost each and every week. I mean, double digits in every game since week 6, except for 3 games, so been very consistent. The ceiling's not high with Hunter Henry. There's not really any touchdown upside. He has 1 touchdown on the season, but the volume's there, the targets there, the catches are there. PPR formats, Hunter Henry should come through for you most weeks, and he could end up being a player that could definitely help you out throughout the fantasy playoffs. All right, let's move into 1 or 2 options at tight end that you can actually use this week, and let's start with Luke Schoonmaker, who gets a fantastic matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals in week 14, one of the worst teams against tight ends, and he was solid in week 13 against the Giants, who, by the way, have actually been really good against tight ends from a fantasy perspective. 8.3 fantasy points, not great by any means, but if you're absolutely desperate to stream him, maybe okay enough. But the previous 2 weeks, 14.5 points and 11.6 points as well. Now, this is going to be contingent on Jake Ferguson, who did not play this past week, dealing with a concussion. If Ferguson comes back, then Shoemaker's value is obviously going to take a hit here. And I will mention that Jake Ferguson has dropped to 63% rostered. So if he's out there and available, it's a great matchup against the Bengals and another really solid matchup against the Panthers the following week. But if Shoemaker ends up being the starting tight end in week 14, he's definitely worth a shot if you have to stream a tight end this week. So maybe sit back, kind of see how this one plays out as the week progresses. But Shoemaker against the Bengals could absolutely be a startable tight end in week 14. And then last but not least, let's take a look at the tight end who played the Cincinnati Bengals this past week, and that is Pat Freiermuth, who was on our streaming list in the Sneaky Starts and Streaming video for tight ends as well. He sits at 42% rostered, and this was Pat Freiermuth's best game of the entire season with 18.8 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 catches, 68 receiving yards, and his 4th touchdown on the season. Very solid day, great matchup. Not as strong of a matchup against Cleveland at home here in week 14, but definitely a streamable tight end who could bring a floor to your fantasy lineup. Don't know how high the ceiling is going to be this week, but I'm almost expecting some fireworks this time between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. We'll find out what happens, but just a solid play. Nothing really else to it. I don't think the ceiling's as high this week due to the matchup, but Pat Freiermuth, certainly startable and maybe a player who's out there on the waivers if you're getting hit by the biocalypse. That'll do it for today's video. There are your must-add waiver wire additions moving into week 14 of the fantasy season. As always, guys, I will answer as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I can. So make sure you guys drop your fantasy questions down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because as the week progresses, we're going to have absolutely everything you need here on the channel to help you dominate week 14 of the 2024 fantasy football season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.